Welcome to another lecture on mysticism and psychedelics. This is lecture 3, and I've loosely titled it, What Do We Need in Order to Study Psychedelics Today? A few questions have been brought up in class discussions so far that as to what constitutes a psychedelic as opposed to other drugs, and questions about are we going to deal with salvia divinorum and other substances in this class. My initial response to student questions during week 1 was to have us keep in mind the rhetorical nature of the term drug from the outset. The Oxford English Dictionary reports that the term came into English from the French after the French invasion during the 14th century, and that the quote here is, originally any substance of animal, vegetable, or mineral origin used as an ingredient in pharmacy, chemistry, dyeing, or various manufacturing processes. In later use, it's specifically a natural or synthetic substance used in the prevention or treatment of disease, a medicine, also a substance that has a physiological effect on a living organism. If a drug is defined as having a physiological effect, almost everything we ingest is potentially a drug, such as this coffee that I'm going to take a sip of right now. Definitely a consciousness altering one in the morning. And I know that there are layers of awareness around that sort of lurk behind this definition, but such a statement, of course, sounds absurd. Like I think a lot of people they feel like they know what drugs are, just like psychedelics. We know what they are without having a definition necessarily. But it's good to look at the history of definitions. So I state this very broad definition in order to highlight the relationship between language and power that is at the heart of research around both psychedelics and mysticism. So rhetorical awareness remains key, and discourse analysis will be necessary to our methodology of studying these issues in at least in my course. So psychedelics are a special class of drugs, just to be very clear, if we move towards a definition here. Though we know from previous lectures that the word psychedelic, which means mind manifesting, was coined by Dr. Humphrey Osmond in a letter to Aldous Huxley in 1957. From the perspective I'm teaching these lectures, which relies on rhetorical theory and discourse analysis, we have to be attentive to the clear motivations that Huxley and Osmond had as their excitement about the potential for psychedelics led them to actively use their new term to replace the term psychotomimetic, which means mimicking psychosis. Their attention to language reveals their rhetorical motivations. From a more rigorous point of view, if psychedelics do indeed manifest the mind, what do they mean by mind, right? Psychedelic drugs particularly act on our brain's 5-HT or 5-hydroxytryptamine or serotonin receptors. So we can just say 5-HT is serotonin. Serotonin 5-HT2A receptors are widely distributed in the central nervous system, especially in the brain region essential for learning and cognition. In addition to endogenous 5-HT, several hallucinogens, antipsychotics, and antidepressants function by targeting 5-HT2A receptors. Preclinical studies show that 5-HT2A receptor antagonists have antipsychotic and antidepressant properties, whereas agonist ligands possess cognition enhancing and hallucinogenic properties. So important from that's a quote from an article by Zhang et al. That I have quoted in the notes here. But I think important there is that serotonin 2A receptors, importantly, also affect memory and cognition, which we don't always think about right away when we're starting to think about psychedelics. They say that based on the results from their study in their lab, it appears that the activation of 5-HT2A receptors may offer a novel approach to the treatment of learning and memory associated with several neurodegenerative disorders. Meanwhile, blockade of the 5-HT2A receptors may offer a feasible way to suppress drug craving and or relapse. It will be very interesting to identify the corresponding signaling pathways by which 5-HT2A receptors modulate these behavioral capacities. Now, that article that I'm citing there is from 2015, and so there's been more work, obviously, like scientific knowledge is just changing rapidly. But that at least gives us a little bit, as those of us who are not brain sciences from the outset, a little bit more direction. I'll give a few more definitions here. So recently, Matthew W. Johns and others in their article have defined classic psychedelics thusly, quote, classic psychedelics, fall within one of two general structural categories. One category includes variations on the structure of tryptamine. Examples include LSD, psilocybin, and dimethyltryptamine, a psychoactive compound present in South American sacramental beverages known as ayahuasca. The second category includes variations on the structure of phenethylamine. One example is mescaline, the main psychoactive agent in the peyote or Lophophora williamsi, or San Pedro, Echinopsis pachanoi, those are the Latin names, and Peruvian torch, or Echinopsis peruvianus cacti. So a variety of synthetic compounds not known to occur in nature also follow in the phenethylamine category. Indigenous cultures in the Western Hemisphere have used compounds from both structural classes and in the sacramental use, and notice that we'll come back to that word sacrament, in the sacramental use of ayahuasca, psilocybin containing mushrooms, and mescaline containing cacti. One analog of phenethylamine is methyl N-O-dioxymethamphetamine, or MDMA, right? Or Molly, as they call it on the street, or ecstasy, right? Which causes psychoactive effects with only partial overlap with classic psychedelics, and which works primarily via serotonin release rather than 5-HT2AR agonism. So someone asked me last week, what's the difference with MDMA or ecstasy versus classic psychedelics? And that's why I'm citing this article here. So like MDMA, other drugs sometimes labeled as psychedelic, such as NMDA antagonists, anticholinergics, cannabinoids, salvinorin A, ibogaine, which are not classic psychedelics, they're not going to review them in their paper. And we're not going to deal with them explicitly in my class either, unless you want to do specific research around something like treatment with ibogaine and drug use or something like that. We could maybe make room in research papers for something like that. But generally the datura plants, things like that, like the salvia plant, we're not going to be spending a lot of class time on that kind of stuff, but it might cross over because a lot of ayahuasca gueros are combining that kind of stuff in their various ceremonies. And so also bufo, like toad stuff, or toe. There are different substances, and so sometimes if people go to an ayahuasca retreat, and at least one, I can think of one that I went to where people were using ayahuasca for the nighttime ceremony, and then the facilitators were administering toe the next morning. So the substances sometimes relate, but they do really different things to us, and we can talk about more of that in class. So, although reviews, they just back to this quote from these authors, although reviews with some overlap to the present manuscript have been published, and they cite them, and you can look at my notes. These provide detailed coverage of each domain of the present review, which is epidemiology, therapeutics, mystical experience, and the brain network function. So despite this useful definition, in the abstract to their article, and there's a little piece in this quotation, the authors state, quote, classic psychedelics have been administered as sacraments since ancient times. I tend to find such statements highly uncritical, especially since we know that the term psychedelic itself is a very recent, and that the term sacrament is loaded with Euro-Christian baggage. So just like I would say that the Huxley and Osmond had a rhetorical purpose for naming psychotomimetics, for renaming them psychedelics, and so their motivations are behind that. There are what I will call Euro-Christian baggage with the term sacrament itself. And this is a religious studies class, and we really need to be attentive to that, especially on the mysticism angle for this particular inquiry into psychedelics. So as we get into their article, they cite multiple articles when referring to ancient use. They do that thing that I mentioned in a previous lecture, where like APA style articles can list just like a whole bunch of different names without contextualizing what was said in those particular articles. The researcher is just expected to either take it at its face value or to go back and dig into it. And what I'm trying to show you is that we should dig back into people's research, not in a mean way or anything, but I'm bringing up a critical approach to psychedelics that we in religious studies especially need to attend to. Those of us who can bring our expertise that's not brain science expertise to these discussions. So the term sacrament, I'm saying, is loaded with Euro-Christian baggage. So as we get into their article, they cite multiple articles. The first one is a collection of authors, including Carl A.P. Ruck, who's a co-author for R. Gordon Wasson's Persephone's Quest, which we will be dealing with in this class in a few weeks. That article is about the possibility of a prehistoric mural in Spain that depicts fungoid figures that are hypothesized in that article to be neurotropic. And the particular substance here is Psilocybe hispanica, which is a kind of Spanish mushroom, right? So I don't find a problem with that original article. I mean, they're very clear that this is just a hypothesis. But when we read it in the current article and it's just in a list of names, we forget that that's a hypothesis. And we start to take the hypothesis as a proven fact. Can you see how that might be a problem scientifically and for the ways that we are building knowledge? Again, I've said in my opening lectures that so much psychedelic literature has that motivation to get a more positive public perception of psychedelics because of the war on drugs, right? So that's the rhetorical situation that writers and researchers on psychedelics have to contend with. And I'm drawing specific attention in my lectures to that context, because that context provides part of an inquiry into what we might call set and setting, right? And it could deal, the set are the assumptions or the ways that we might think about an experience going into it, and then the setting itself. You can think about the setting of academic discourse in this particular case. So while the authors, so back to this article that's about psilocybe hispanica, while the authors use the term ritual, the word sacrament does not appear in their article, and they are careful to stress the hypothetical nature of their work. They note that there is physical evidence that both ancient Mexicans and Siberians used mushrooms, though the famous Amanita muscaria used in Siberian groups has a different neurological effect than psilocybe mushrooms. Quote, these historic traditions, they say, of native Mexico and Siberia are well documented, but their cultural origins are unclear. But their cultural origins are unclear. So somebody was pushing back on me on when I said that the widespread use of the term shaman, which I know gets used throughout Amazonia as well, is a misnomer, right? It came from a colonialist tendency to collect practices from Siberian peoples, the Tungus people, and incorporate them into what was in the 19th century the building of the Russian museum. And that language got spread through comparative religion or world religions to a broad category of this functionary called a shaman that we then see it throughout discourse that attributes a particular kind of special quality to this figure, and says that all human cultures across the globe and in the ancient times have this kind of shamanic type of figure. And then we have neo-shamanism and all sorts of new identity formations that are based on this extracted category from a very particular group. I would push you to say that, like, so for Runa Kuna people in Peru, the term yashak is not the same thing as shaman. It doesn't mean the same thing. A yeshka for Osage people is not the same thing as a shaman, and I want to push us against that kind of colonizing, universalizing gaze that wants to take this category from late 19th century and early 20th century comparative religious studies, with all of the problems that we can see in that, the flawed methods, and be a little more critical, more attentive, and especially more attentive to the variation among different indigenous groups instead of collapsing them all together. And we'll have more articles about that as we go on throughout the course. So these authors, I'm appreciative of them by saying that their cultural origins are unclear. This is the tension in anthropology, if you're an anthropology student, between physical anthropology and cultural anthropology. Archaeology, which studies artifacts, belongs to physical anthropology. Cultural anthropology studies behavior, right? And the ways that people might interact with those artifacts. But when it comes to ancient cultures, we can base a lot more evidence on the archaeology, on the physical artifacts, but the cultural stuff becomes much more speculative. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but it has to be like quite a bit of humility when we look at the ancient world. And we should not maybe just assume that modern day living people, like indigenous people, that they have direct access to something like Paleolithic times. That comes from a kind of racism that comes out of what I've called in earlier lectures the Euro Christian fantasy structure. We'll come back to that. So I think that this first article that they cite is okay. In addition to obscure cultural origins, just how these people actually used the substances, even if we know that they used the substances, and the social functions they played in respective cultures are also a mystery. So I will, in this and following lectures, that emphasize that uncritical and romanticized assumptions about the archaic revival saturate work on psychedelics. And I'm just fixing something here. Emphasize. Left out the word emphasize there in my notes. Yeah, so these assumptions, romanticized assumptions about the archaic revival, saturate work on psychedelics, even among scholarly peer-reviewed information. We need to be, therefore, more rigorous, both historically and from the critical work that has been done within the discipline of religious studies that attends to the frequently unspoken Euro-Christian biases in research. Just like we might think of only the positive, focusing only on the positive aspects of psychedelics, they might give us, as researchers, a kind of confirmation bias where we're only looking for the good attributes because we need to push back against these ridiculous drug scheduling laws that the U.S. government imposed and then imposed onto the rest of the world through the United Nations and through its political force as a nation, right? So I understand the ridiculousness of that, but that does not give us an excuse as researchers to not be rigorous and to not be reflective on our own possible confirmation biases. So the second article that's cited in this article I'm working with here by Johnson and others is from a brief correspondence in The Lancet, which is an important journal. It was published in 2002, this particular article, and it was titled Mescaline Use for 5,700 Years. This article also does not use the term sacrament, but simply states, from a scientific perspective, the studied peyote material seems to be the oldest plant drug that yielded a major bioactive compound on chemical analysis. From a cultural point of view, our identification of mescaline strengthens the evidence that Native Americans already recognized and valued the psychotropic properties of peyote as long as 5,700 years ago. But recognition and value does not necessarily mean sacred or sacramental. Those are Euro-Christian terms that get brought to Turtle Island. The notions of sacred and sacramental. You can think about it in a flipped way as well. Why all of this attention to mescaline as a possible sacrament and not to corn, not to maize, right? Which anybody who's been to Central America will know that Mayan people, the corn that they grow there, it also tastes better down there. Corn, chocolate, tobacco, these substances that we do not think of in the same sort of drug type categories, to say that they were not, revered in whatever in the same sort of register that something like mescaline was. So this emphasis that we have in Euro-Christian culture and Euro-Christian science to isolate something and extract a category and then analyze it, that completely decontextualizes the substance from the culture. And then by labeling it something like sacred, again, we're re-emphasizing that extractive separating quality, and therefore falling into all sorts of traps about the assumptions we might make about the cultural uses of the historical drugs. And then there's this impulse that we have that I'm trying to be very critical of, which is to say, like, well, these drug schedules are ridiculous because humans have used these substances since time immemorial, right? We can see that that's the motivating factor beneath a lot of stuff. And humans have used that. I think that that's a fact. That's a well-established fact. That humans have used psychoactive substances since time immemorial. How they were used in particular groups will be quite a mystery to us, that I want to hold space for the very, very different ways and worldviews with which these substances, as we call them in Euro-Christian culture, they might be called people in indigenous contexts, for example. I want to be attentive and respectful to the possibility for very, very different worldviews when it comes to this stuff. So the problem I'm highlighting speaks to the reason that for our course on mysticism and psychedelics, right? This particular lecture series. By appealing to the historical uses of certain substances since ancient times, researchers and users have sought to validate the substances restricted by the war on drugs. In addition to ancient use, they frequently apply the very Euro-Christian notions of sacrament and sacred. They especially relate this to speculative studies on the Soma ritual in ancient India, and then superimpose a universal world history, which is again a Euro-Christian disposition, onto uses of the substances. Our term sacred literally means to set aside, to make something special. Researchers often gesture to the ritual or sacramental use of ayahuasca by indigenous groups in South America, yet the only legally recognized ayahuasca religions in the world today are avowedly Christian in their theology. They arose in the 20th century, but a Euro-Christian fantasy structure imposes a romanticized otherness onto the miraculous powers of these mysterious, quote, New World substances. And that is an impulse that has been going on since the beginning of colonization, since the beginning of the invasion of Turtle Island and Abya Yala, or however you want to term the South American continent today. That's maybe not a concept that was widely applied at the time. And sometimes people will call Turtle Island both continents as well, various different indigenous groups. So when we look at basically the European invasion and colonization of these lands, there is an ongoing fantasy about what kinds of riches, miraculous substances these lands have, and how they can be extracted and taken back to basically, make Europe rich, which they very much did for a long time, although Europe is struggling today from the same kinds of colonialism, right? That with the situation in Ukraine and the colonialist moves that Russia is making in dire situations, that we should be attentive today. Hitler called Ukraine his Old West. He really thought of that area as the area that was wild, and that he would conquer just like the Americans conquered the Indians. So the fantasy structures of colonialism persist throughout Euro-Christian history in really dark ways at times. In anthropology and psychedelic studies, this debate has been playing out in over historical uses of substances. This debate has been playing out with respect to claims that researchers such as David Lewis Williams have made about ancient rock and formations and or ancient rock art and psychoactive substances. Researchers in the Lewis-Williams camp speculate that interactions between archaic Homo sapiens as well as other species of Homo erectus, for example, possibly Neanderthal, for example, and psychoactive substances in and during the last 100,000 years or so, produced profound meta-reflective experiences in the various apes' brains. So, like, I mean, Lewis Williams is dealing with rock art, which is an archaic Homo sapiens sort of function. We don't have exactly clear dates, so it's around Homo erectus before archaic Homo sapiens. And Neanderthal and the different species names and things like that. So I'm not going to get into a physical anthropology lecture, but I know I'm being a little bit loosey goosey with those terms as well. I mean, like, but now I can look at my own DNA reports and see Neanderthal as well, right? So, the different species categories, there was clearly admixture, and so I'm just allowing a little bit of fluidity there. But when we look at ancient rock art, this is going on in various places in the world. So at the extreme end of the speculations around the meta-reflective experiences that are produced by using something like mushrooms, for example, or a psychedelic substance, the meta-reflective experience produced this kind of pondering about the meaning of life and the power of life that gave rise to earlier forms of religion or ceremonial use. So that's the speculation, is that, that archaic Homo sapiens in various forms, maybe as they're extending their footprint on the globe, that they come across and eat. You're trying to eat substances and you eat mushrooms and you have this experience, and then that profound experience seems special, and that sort of catalyzes cognition centers in our brain and produces what we might call, in evolutionary terms, our consciousness, our ability to meta reflect on things. That's the speculation. It's a lot of speculation, as you can see, and then ceremonial use and what we might call more formalized religion. Then is speculated to come from psychedelic substances. The Euro-Christian disposition produced during the early modern era emphasized a linear and historicizing gaze on the structure of human and animal life. And you can feel that I'm doing that too, right? Because I'm talking, I'm putting a foot in the anthropology camp and talking about ancient uses. But much of our impulse as Euro-Christians, as those who have inherited science, for example, much of this historicizing occurred around the term 1000 CE. So it's very recent, is what I'm saying. Recent meaning the last 1,000 years. As a widespread notion of Christendom across the European continent reacted to the first millennium and speculated that this would be the time of Christ's return, or the parousia, or the second coming. This is where we get the term millenarian from. So what I'm asking us to do, like, as we think about researching psychedelics, and especially interactions among indigenous groups with various substances around the world, is that we have a self-awareness about the kind of Euro-Christian baggage and worldview that we are bringing to the study of psychedelics, and that scientists often bring without being very critical of. And so what I want us to emphasize is that even this impulse to historicize, to put everything onto a linear map of this happened and then this happened, that evolutionary scale that is so saturating of the rhetoric around psychedelics, that we package that within its Euro-Christian cultural context. And so the shadow text, the shadow part of culture is the Christian metaphysics, right? That sees a that looks back to the beginning of time and then sees the arrival of Christ, and if we're thinking about St. Paul, as a kind of new type of Adam and his typological analysis, and then a projection towards the future when that Christ person will come back. So all of that is producing in the Euro-Christian worldview a kind of linear temporality that even when science moves away from religion per se, it carries on that kind of linear type of cause and effect type of thinking. So if we jump back to the late medieval / early modern period, one of the most famous promoters of the millenarian thought during that period was the Italian theologian Joachim of Fiore, who lived, circa 1135 to circa 1202. And this is just one example of many, but he became an influential apocalyptic writer. The term apocalypse in Greek is the Greek word for revealing or revelation, as in the last book of the Christian New Testament. In mythology and theology, we refer to such thinking as eschatology, or speculations on the end of the world. Due to the idea of the second coming and its the idea that it was imminent, that it was about to arrive, because it had been about 1,000 years. So this is like in the Euro-Christian calendar, the year of our Lord, or AD, which we use and we call it CE now instead of the Christian terminology, of in the world, the year of our Lord. Well, just because we name it something different doesn't mean that we're not still using a Euro-Christian temporality or a sense of time. The Gregorian calendar, for example, as opposed to the Mayan calendar, as opposed to various different indigenous ways of looking at and conceiving time and temporality. So we're coming with a lot of cognitive bias from the Euro-Christian way of looking at the world. It's not biasness always in a bad sense, but we need to be aware of that kind of way of thinking about time and history that is completely foreign to indigenous cultures around the world. So going back again, so this is during this time period, the idea that it's been about 1,000 years since Christ was on the planet, and that the Bible had said that Jerusalem would again be in the hands of true believers. So remember, the Bible didn't exist, or at least the New Testament did not exist when Christ was alive, right? So this is all a later thing. But the Bible said that Jerusalem would again be in the hands of true believers. So crusading starts developing between 1095 and 1291 CE across Europe. And this was enacted as an impulse to retake the Holy Land from Muslim control and to help prepare the way for the Second Coming. They were also the efforts to aid the Eastern Orthodox or Byzantine Church against Muslims. Islam was relatively new in 1095, just a few hundred years old at that point. But it had spread very quickly. And crusades were massive economic undertakings requiring all sorts of resources. People who led them and participated in them were granted what the Catholic Church at the time called indulgences. And so they were granted this by the Pope and various priests. Indulgences had arisen with the doctrine of purgatory, which became formalized at the end of the 12th century, at least in the Catholic West, though not in the Orthodox or Byzantine East. So there are two Christian churches, right? The Eastern Orthodox at this particular time. So being granted indulgences meant that one's time in purgatory could be shortened, right? Trade with the Far East brought print technology to Europe, so it's invented in China first. And interactions with Muslim civilization brought a new age of discovery, and in quotes, and eventually Renaissance, what we call the Renaissance or the rebirth of the ancient world to Europe. So mathematical concepts and Arabic numerals, they're called Arabic numerals for a reason, made the building of massive cathedrals and the formation of guilds and stonemasons possible in Europe. So it was from those wars of the Crusades that the European or Euro-Christians start this the projects that will become, in a broader sense, Christendom later on, and that build the massive, cathedrals that people still go to Europe and admire today. So it was also during this period, with its constant looking back on ancient texts and that discourse, that discourse on mysticism and historicism developed. So remember, I'm teaching this class, if you look at the syllabus, from the idea of a kind of nostalgia for God. And it's partly because of that historicist impulse that arises in the late medieval and early modern times. So it was also during this time period that the annihilation of non-Christians, especially Jews, throughout Europe became part of the enthusiasm of apocalyptic Christian thinking. So the idea that Jews were the ones who killed Christ becomes widespread throughout Europe during this period. But during the first 1,000 years, and you can ask me for sources on this, generally it was the Romans who killed Christ. But because there's this new social movement that I've called Euro-Christian, and this is why it's Euro-Christian, the Roman acceptance, transition, conversion to Christianity following Constantine and others, from the early 4th century on. So that this massive period of flux going on between the 4th century and the late medieval times. By late medieval times, Christianity is being conceived in its completely Roman form, right? And it is only then that there's this distinction of the Jews as being completely separate from Christianity. We know, of course, Christianity came from Judaism, or from Jewish people anyway, and that now Jews could be othered and they could be vilified as preventing as the enemies of Rome as well too. So the Rome had colonized Jerusalem during the biblical times, right? So we see that that's what I mean by colonialism, and also the Euro-Christian worldview, why it's Euro and why it's Christian, why it's a social movement and not just a kind of capital R religion belief system that we might think of today. So there's this historicizing impulse that comes with the Euro-Christian belief that the Christ is going to have a second coming. That produces crusades, it produces social movements, it produces all sorts of economic development and trade necessity across the Mediterranean and Asia with the Silk Road, various shifts, right, in the way in human cultures. So with historicism came the uniqueness of the supposed direct experience of mystics. This was also the period where the authenticity of mystics became increasingly scrutinized, and the development of heresy and individual authorship or witch trials arose, etc. I said this last week, that subjectivity, individuality, is a kind of poetic invention of Euro-Christianity. And that's one of various reasons why we don't want to project that kind of individual rights-based thinking back onto ancient cultures, because when we do that, we're uncritically colonizing other people with our Euro-Christian worldviews. So there are various ways to look at the period. And I don't only have so much time today. I have found the economic analyses of Silvia Federici invaluable for thinking about what was truly at stake in witch trials. For example, women, especially older and widowed, could at the time be tied to familial land ownership a tie that came from pagan cultures throughout Europe before the arrival of Christianity. Increasingly, though, during this period, late medieval, early modern, land tenure rights and the feudal system were increasingly dissolved and transformed into early modern patriarchal systems of lords and nobility, which isn't to say that during the feudal system that it wasn't already patriarchal. In Caliban and the Witch, Silvia Federici shows how witch trials were developed to remove land rights of women who refused or were otherwise deemed unable to be married. Like an old hag, for example, right? Women's inability to vote, like think about Parliament, right? It wasn't even until the 20th century that women got the right to vote in England. So women's inability to vote were balanced at the time by their ties to the new landed estates as Roman Christian patriarchal culture became dominant. But even this word dominant, right, is relevant here. And it comes from the Latin dominus, the same word from which we get domicile, house, right? In Roman law, the dominate as a noun, the dominate, was under control of the pater or father, right? Patriarchal pater, right? In Anglo-Saxon or Old English, so when we look, I'm kind of want us to see like the difference between pagan culture and the colonizing Roman Christian culture and how these two mix, right? So in Anglo-Saxon or in Old English, both of the words Lord and Lady that we have today shifted from their original meaning with the imposition of patriarchal Latin, which imposed domine, which is the masculine, or domina, feminine, onto the Old English words hlaford and hlafdig, or hlafdi. Hlaford was a compound word meaning loaf, hlaf, loaf, hlaford, weird, or guard, or warden. So we have the same roots today in our modern English. So hlaford, which gets shortened to lord, literally meant the garter or the warden of loaves of bread, right? Hlafdia was a compound of loaf plus the root word for dough, which is what loaves are made out of, obviously. But the di sound, the dy at the end of lady, is also from the Proto-Indo-European term or root word for home, the same root that we get for dom or domicile or dominus in Latin. So linguistically, you have this older, even pre-Latin sense that associated women with the land. Then you have the imposition of Roman Christianity with its patriarchal worldview, imposing its gendered notion of the dominant, through the political theological notion of Christendom. The D-O-M at the end of Christen is that dom, right? The house, Christendom is this political project to make the world into the house of Christ. Although worship of Mary existed in early Christianity, there was a great explosion in Marianism during the 12th and 13th centuries, which coincided with the widespread notion of Christendom throughout Europe. Although this was a patriarchal project, Elaine Pagels, in her wonderful book, The Gnostic Gospels, and many scholars who followed Pagels, argues that early Christian culture was not necessarily as patriarchal as the Roman Christian version that became Orthodox and Catholic or, quote, universal. The patriarchal nature of Roman Christianity and its shifting relationships to land then helped the explosion of women mystics and witchcraft trials, right? So what I'm getting at is that we need to take a really critical historical view of the imposition or the colonization of European pagan cultures and the ways that women existed within them, And the way that that gendered concept of women and patriarchy got imposed onto previously matriarchal cultures there. We don't need to fantasize so much about even indigenous cultures throughout Turtle Island, which were also matriarchal and still are, um, in order to see this the the colonialism of gender and Euro-Christian gendering at work. So, mysticism during this period itself became increasingly as more associated with the contemplative life and ecstatic experiences. At the same time, it became associated with the Catholic theology and doctrines of grace versus Protestant, which is a little bit later. I'm getting into like the 1500s here, right? The Protestant, especially Calvinist doctrines of works. So, as Nicholas Longless points out in his book Neuropsychedelia, by the end of the 20th century and after the influence of writers like Max Weber, contemplative mysticism was seen as world-denying love, in tension with a capitalist-oriented notion of ascetic or hard work and individual flourishing. As Max Weber conceived it, the Calvinist ethic meshed with early capitalism in the idea of an exceptional or elect who would manifest their state of salvation by Christ through the display of their good deeds. You can think of manifest destiny in the 19th century as one version of that social impulse, that Euro-Christian impulse. And that the constant use of the language of like a city on a hill illusion in American politics, which happens today. Like you can read books. Almost every president has used that language since the mid 19th century, including Donald Trump and including Biden and including Clinton, people who are running. So the rhetoric of the city on the hill is that Euro-Christian element that saturates even American politics, no matter how secular you might want to see American politics. So in early American culture, both mysticism and Catholicism were viewed with suspicion by the anti-papal or anti-Catholic Anglo-Protestants who began their various colonies in, quote, New England. Maryland, the state, what became the state of Maryland, was a tolerated Catholic colony that also allowed other nonconformist groups such as the Labadists, who were a quietist sect. William Penn and Pennsylvania were the land of the Quakers, another quietist sect. To be a nonconformist at the time meant not to conform to the Anglican Church of England, which broke with the Catholic Church under Henry VIII in the 1530s. Sometimes these groups fall into a category of mystical theology because of the emphasis on contemplation or quietism over action, hence an emphasis on grace as opposed to works. American religious culture following the Great Awakening during the early 1700s came to be established by a kind of individualistic piety that also emphasizes direct experiences with the divine. So even in neo-shamanism, there's still this very old American impulse to claim your individuality, to extract yourself, say, oh, I reject so-called organized religion and I'm going to find my own pathway, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's various indigenous systems. It's that focus on the individual and its ability to find its own piety that's part of a longer Euro-Christian impulse, even though it's not Christian with a capital C, right? It's still the social formation of the Euro-Christian worldview. So Longlitz points out during that drug use during the 1960s came to resonate with a rejection of Calvinist Protestantism. He cites the hippie thinker Jerry Rubin, who says, quote, drug use signifies, so he's writing in the 60s when he says this, drug use signifies the total end of the Protestant ethic. Screw work. We want to know ourselves. But of course, the goal is to free oneself from American society's notion of work, success, reward, and the status and to find oneself through one's own discipline, hard work, and introspection. Longlitz writes that representatives of the psychedelic movement presented their conflict with the so-called establishment as a fight over religious values, and that in the course of the 1960s, the struggle over hallucinogens became a political struggle over the spiritual foundation of America's social and economic order. For those of us who are interested in mysticism today, I think we really need to look at the discourse of the 60s and these social movements and transformation in order to really reflect on where our own individual impulses towards shamanism, towards neo-paganism, towards various impulses, how that might fit in a broader social fabric and maybe might not be our own individual metaphysical claims about reality. That's what I would like us to think about as researchers on psychedelics, and mysticism, because the research shows us over and over again these social formations through language that might inhabit our thinking and we don't even know it. Longlitz also gives a good account of the period between the 1960s and the psychedelic revival since the decade of the brain. The more that you read in the field of psychedelic studies, the more you will see some version of this narrative or these narratives since the 1960s. It's being rehashed over and over again in psychedelic literature. One important aspect of Longlitz's study is to note that calling for control and regulation of substances is not necessarily inherently about a bias against consciousness-altering substances. This is an important part, I think, of Longlitz's book. So Longlitz notes that, quote, in 1961, the thalidomide disaster came to the fore. 8,000 children with gross anatomical formations, an unknown number of abortions, and many patients suffering from peripheral neuropathy sounded alarms about doctors' nonchalant prescriptions of investigational drugs. I've already mentioned in other lectures a deep critique of language around the rationality and the scientific expert or the establishment during the early 1960s. If you've ever watched episodes of the original Twilight Zone series, you've seen this critique at work. Remember, science gave us all sorts of good things, but it also gave us the atomic bombs in World War II and the ability to destroy ourselves, and kids who were ducking under desks and nuclear drills in the 50s and 60s. So in his early pages of his book, Longlitz discusses Huxley's work and his coining of the term neurotheology. He also notes that the sociologist Theodore Roszak's Making of the Counterculture book, popular book from the late 60s, also coins the term counterculture, drew upon critiques of the scientific and technocratic establishment. So for critics at the time of the Vietnam War, a similar critique was made of the systems theory progenitors of war policy like Robert McNamara that seemed oblivious to concerns about human rights and colonialism. Looking back at the 1960s, we can see that youth movements of various nations around the world were initiating what has been termed now, since the 1970s, globalization. So that term globalization gets coined in the early 70s. Longlitz gives an interesting account of Rick Doblin, the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, in the 1980s, whose clear intention is to mainstream psychedelics and is eschewing countercultural associations from the 1960s. In this neurotheological view, to use Longlitz's language, quote, mysticism is narrowed down to peak experiences and isolated neural events. Thereby, it is supposedly stripped of cultural difference and antagonism. Longlitz notes the influence of Huxley's perennial philosophy, which was itself indebted to Leibniz, a philosopher from the 1700s. Quote, The supposed transcultural nature of drug-induced mystical revelations lends itself to a politics of confessional reconciliation, which had already been the goal of the perennial philosophy in 17th century Prussia, what we would call today Germany. So here again, I must emphasize the Euro-Christian rhetorical framing and influencing of both set and setting of psychedelics in contemporary discourse. The Euro-Christian drama of religious wars had already produced the notion of universalism that informed Enlightenment accounts to overcome violence among various sects of Christianity. Doblin and others tried to advocate for psychedelics' ability to give a universal experience against a global rise of religious fundamentalism in the late 20th century. Longlitz notes that Huxley's theory of the mind at large and the idea of consciousness is a reducing valve remains popular today, though in secularized form. He also notes that this is especially interesting given the fact that the current brain science tells us that the brain is not so much a reducing valve, but a generator of consciousness itself. I'll come back to that quite a bit, but this is not just the time to go into my own work, but I will at least let you know that my own emphasis on worldview that you hear me doing in these lectures comes from a cognitive science perspective that rests on these much more recent observations about brain science. So what Longlitz points out then is an important tension between current brain science in the 21st century and hallucinogen research that continues to rely on the Huxleyan or Bergsonian, remember Henry Bergson, a French philosopher that Huxley drew on. So current hallucinogen research continues to rely on the Huxleyan Bergsonian reducing valve model. And this would be an excellent research paper project for this particular class, and will likely at least be touched on for midterm papers as well when I ask you to think about lectures. So just really quickly to recap that, I've gone into this historical lecture today about Euro-Christian history, and I've needed to do that to develop where mysticism as we know it comes from, even though we can talk about Jewish mysticism and other forms of mysticism as well. The problem is that discursively we are operating in a Euro-Christian context. Even science, as the language of science, is still operating from a Euro-Christian worldview, which has a kind of linear historical temporality that it imposes onto the world. Evolutionary theory is another one of these things. And this is not to say, I'm not at all coming out against evolutionary theory at all, but I am emphasizing that it comes from a Euro-Christian worldview and way of relating to the world that is entirely foreign to the various indigenous groups around the world. And if we are going to resist the trap of universalizing a Euro-Christian worldview and imposing it onto ancient cultures with notions of archaic revivals, shamanism, all of these problematic terms, then we need to be aware of that Euro-Christian worldview and also of the impulses that we might have to cognitive bias or confirmation bias when it comes to studying psychedelics. So overall, in neuropsychedelia, Longlitz notes that we need ethical human subject research for psychedelics because rats cannot give us trip reports and because in all hard science laboratories, religious questions arise. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London has been a significant researcher on psychedelics in the brain, and Taves cited Carhart Harris's work in the mystical and other alterations in sense and self, an expanded framework for studying non-ordinary experiences, an article that we read last week. Carhart Harris argues that ego is an emergent property of self-organized activity in the DMN, or the default mode network. Taves has argued that we need to include assessments of narrative in surveying mystical experiences, though she uses the term index of non-ordinary experience. This is a quote from Taves. She says, "To more clearly understand what people experience subjectively, we need narrative reports. To understand the process of interpretation, we need narrative reports, oral or written, elicited immediately after the event and the later intervals. Careful analysis of continuity and changes in the accounts will allow us to reconstruct the interpretive process as the experience is recounted over time. Although we have access to the real-time experience only through post hoc accounts that inevitably change it, interviews that probe the initial process of putting the experience into words may enable us to make plausible inferences regarding the real-time experience. These kinds of data, coupled with more objective measures, will allow us to more fully investigate the interactions between these frames." So from the disciplines of philosophy and religious studies, it is important to notice that some of our most current researchers are focusing on the ideas of language and narrative. Hence my approach, the rhetorical approach to psychedelic literatures in this particular class. So writing in 2013, Longlitz pointed out that psychedelics like LSD are generally on the wane in terms of street drug use because of their non-addictive qualities, which make them less lucrative to sell, and maintain a consistent customer base. Yet a resurgence in psychedelic testing in the decade of the brain has proved fruitful for both scientific and religious perspectives. His field work in laboratories in the United States and Switzerland suggests, quote, that the current resurgence of psychedelic science is not just another story of disenchantment from magic mushrooms to 5-HT2A receptor agonists, but has produced a form of laboratory life that continues to be suffused with the peculiar kind of mysticism that emerged from the psychedelic culture of the 1950s and 60s. These scientific studies, he claims, do not result in the presentation of bare life, and he ends up arguing that perennial might be a more suitable term as a way to address theological questions and spiritual experiences, which continues to serve as a moral motor for the ongoing revival of scientific studies of hallucinogenic compounds. The perennial, or always returning, right? The perennial, among other uses of this context, resounds with, as a reference to Aldous Huxley's 1940s book, The Perennial Philosophy. We will want to critique this notion of the perennial with respect to more recent work by Taves. We should also be aware that in the addition to the wane of the street use of psychedelics, there's been an increase in other types of drugs. There's little way to determine the quality or purity with respect to drugs on the black market. Even if you bought LSD, you don't necessarily know that it's only LSD in what you're taking. So LSD has long been mixed with other substances, such as that outside of laboratory experiments. It is hard to tell anything that is scientifically verifiable with respect to non-laboratory use of LSD. I'm going to stop there for the week. I hope you found this enlightening, and it's something you can return to. I know it's a very heady lecture, lots of different places that I've gone to today, so I appreciate your patience and your listening as we unpack this rich world of emergent knowledge. Have a good week.